My uncle said, "You've been using our family cabin long enough, so I'm giving it to your cousin." I opened my phone and said, "That's fine, because I already sold the land you built it on." My uncle told me he was giving our family cabin to my cousin during a Sunday dinner with everybody sitting around my grandmother's old dining table and passing around a bowl of mashed potatoes. I honestly thought he was joking at first, not because my uncle was particularly funny, but because what he was saying made absolutely no sense to me. I had spent the previous 3 years paying the property taxes on the land underneath that cabin. I had also paid for the insurance on the structure, handled the utility account, and paid a contractor to fix the septic system after it backed up during a winter storm. Most importantly, the land was legally mine. The cabin itself was a different matter, and that difference was the reason I did not immediately understand why my uncle thought he could hand it to somebody else. My grandfather had owned the property before he died. The land had been in the family for decades. The cabin had been built later by my uncle with my grandfather's permission, but as far as I knew, nobody had ever transferred the land into my uncle's name. When my grandfather died, the land went through probate. My grandmother got part of the estate. My mother and my uncle each received other assets. The cabin property was supposed to be divided as part of an agreement between them. Somehow, that never happened cleanly. My mother told me years later that my grandfather had wanted me to have the land eventually. I never expected that to mean anything in practical terms. I certainly never expected to be sitting at the dinner table watching my uncle announce that he was taking the property away from me. I remember setting my fork down because my hand had started shaking. I had been dealing with my uncle for years, and I knew he had a habit of making statements as though saying them loudly enough turned them into facts. Still, I did not want to make a scene. My grandmother was sitting at the head of the table, and she looked uncomfortable. My mother was staring at her plate. My cousin looked surprised for about 2 seconds, then tried very hard not to smile. That was the first moment I realized this had been discussed before I arrived. My uncle kept explaining that my cousin had always wanted the cabin. He said my cousin had been the one who appreciated it. He said I barely used the place anymore. He said the family thought it made more sense for my cousin to have it. That last part bothered me more than anything. Nobody had asked me. Nobody had spoken to me. Nobody had shown me any paperwork. They had simply decided that the property belonged to my uncle to distribute. I looked at my mother, waiting for her to say something. She finally glanced at me and told me with her expression that she had not expected this either. My uncle kept talking. He described plans for renovations. He talked about how my cousin wanted to bring his friends there and build a deck. He mentioned that he would probably need to replace some of the windows. Then he said something that made me stop listening to the rest. He said that since I had been using the cabin long enough, it was time to give somebody else a chance. That phrase stayed in my head, using the cabin. I had been treating the property as mine because I was the one paying for the land. My uncle apparently saw it as a family cabin that he had authority over. I asked him what exactly he meant by giving it away. He said he was going to sign it over to my cousin. I asked him whether he meant the cabin or the land. He said the whole property. I remember looking down at my phone. I had the county property account open because I had been checking whether a tax assessment had posted. The information was still on the screen. My name was listed as the property owner. The legal description of the parcel was right there. I had pulled it up earlier that week because I was getting ready to refinance another property and needed to confirm a document. I looked at my uncle again. I told him that was fine. Then I told him I had already sold the land the cabin was sitting on. The room went completely silent. I wish I could say I had planned that line and delivered it like some perfect revenge moment. I had not. I was angry, confused, and honestly a little stunned. I had signed the sale agreement 6 weeks earlier. The closing had been scheduled for the following month. I had not told my uncle, because there was no reason I believed he had any say in what I did with my property. I had originally planned to sell the land because I was tired of dealing with the family arguments surrounding it. The cabin was a different issue, and I had not yet decided what I was going to do with it. My uncle stared at me. My cousin stopped smiling. My mother finally looked up. My grandmother asked me whether I was serious. I told her I was. My uncle immediately said I could not sell something that belonged to the family. That was when I realized how little he actually understood about the situation. He thought the cabin and the land were legally one thing. They were not. The story of how that happened is longer than I ever expected it to be. It started years before that dinner, when I was still in my 20s and thought family disagreements were mostly about hurt feelings. My grandfather died when I was 23. He had been sick for a while, so the death itself was not a complete surprise. The probate process was still messy. There were boxes of paperwork. There were old bank statements. There were handwritten notes. There were arguments over furniture. There were disputes about what my grandfather had promised different people, and there was the cabin. The property was outside town in a wooded area that had become more valuable over the years. The cabin itself was nothing special. It was a small single-story structure with a screened porch, 2 bedrooms, a stone fireplace, and a kitchen that looked like it had been frozen in the early 90s. My grandfather had bought the land long before I was born. My uncle had built the cabin with his own money. That part was true. What I did not understand at the time was that building a structure on somebody else's land did not automatically mean you owned the land. My grandfather had let my uncle use it. The entire family called it my uncle's cabin because he was the one who had built it. I grew up hearing that phrase, so I assumed that ownership was straightforward. It was not. After my grandfather died, the estate paperwork listed the land separately from several of the improvements on it. My mother had mentioned that the cabin had not been clearly transferred to my uncle. I was barely paying attention. I had a full-time job. I was renting an apartment. I was trying to pay off student loans. Probate sounded like something older relatives worried about. I did not understand why any of it mattered to me. Then my mother called me one evening and told me my grandfather had left instructions that I should eventually have the land. She said she did not know exactly how it would happen. She said the family would figure it out. I remember telling her that I did not care. That probably sounds strange now. At the time, I honestly did not. I thought owning a wooded parcel with an old cabin several miles from town sounded like more responsibility than it was worth. The estate took more than a year to settle. There were delays with appraisals, there were tax documents, there were conversations with an attorney. Eventually, the deed for the land ended up in my name. I was not there when it happened. My mother handled most of the logistics because I was working long hours. She gave me a folder. Inside were copies of the deed, the probate order, and several other documents. I put the folder in a filing cabinet. That was the end of it as far as I was concerned. My uncle continued using the cabin. Nobody made a big deal out of the land being mine. That was probably the biggest mistake I made. I let everyone continue using the words they had always used. My uncle still called it his cabin. My cousin called it his family's place. My grandmother referred to it as the family cabin. I never corrected anyone. I figured it was easier. For the first few years, I barely went there. Then my grandmother started having mobility issues, and she asked me to look after the property because my uncle had stopped going regularly. The first time I drove out there after taking ownership, I found that the power had been disconnected. I called the utility company. They said the account had been closed months earlier. I opened a new account in my name. Then I discovered the taxes had not been paid. There were notices in an old stack of mail. I paid the balance. My uncle acted offended when he found out. He said he had been planning to handle it. I did not argue, I just kept paying everything. Then a tree fell across the driveway. I hired someone to remove it. The septic system failed. I paid for that too. The roof started leaking. I paid for a repair. One winter, a pipe burst under the kitchen sink. I drove out there on a Saturday morning, cleaned up the water, and paid a plumber. I started to realize something. Everyone in the family thought of the cabin as my uncle's. But whenever the cabin required money, responsibility, or paperwork, I was the one handling it. I did not resent that at first. I thought maybe this was just what family ownership looked like. Then I started keeping records. It was not because I suspected fraud. I had simply gotten tired of losing receipts. I created a folder on my computer with the property tax records, insurance statements, repair invoices, utility bills, and copies of the deed. I also kept paper copies in a binder. That binder ended up becoming the most important thing I owned that year. The trouble started when my cousin got engaged. My cousin had always been close to my uncle. He was the favorite in a way nobody acknowledged directly. My uncle took him fishing. He helped him buy a used truck. He gave him work when he was between jobs. He let him stay at the cabin whenever he wanted. My cousin was not a bad person. That is something I want to make clear. He was entitled in some ways, but I do not think he spent his days plotting against me. He genuinely believed the cabin was eventually going to be his. His father had spent decades telling him that. I had not corrected him because I did not want another family argument. That changed when my cousin started talking about renovating the cabin. He sent photos to the family group chat. He wanted to replace the kitchen. He wanted to add a bathroom. He wanted to turn the screened porch into a heated room. I did not object. I thought he was talking about something that might happen someday. Then one afternoon, I got a call from my insurance company. They said they had received a request for a policy change related to the property. I had no idea what they were talking about. I asked what kind of change. They told me someone had contacted them claiming to be the owner of the cabin and had asked about adding coverage for renovation work. I was confused. The person they had spoken to was my uncle. I asked them whether the property ownership had been changed. They said no. They told me the current policy was still in my name. I thanked them and hung up. I sat at my desk for a while without moving. That was the first real warning sign. Until then, I had assumed my uncle did not understand the legal arrangement. Now I wondered whether he understood it perfectly and simply did not accept it. I called my mother. She was quiet when I told her what happened. Then she admitted that my uncle had been saying for years that my grandfather had always intended the cabin to remain with him. She said there had been disagreements during probate. She said my uncle believed the paperwork had been handled incorrectly. I asked her why nobody had told me. She said because she thought the issue had been settled. That answer bothered me. I looked at the deed again. The legal description was clear. The land was mine, but I also noticed something I had ignored before. There was no separate deed for the cabin. The structure was mentioned in old documents, but the ownership was not as clear as I had assumed. I called the attorney who had handled part of the estate. He was able to review the old probate documents. He told me the situation was unusual. He explained that the land had transferred to me. The cabin had been constructed by my uncle before the transfer. There were references to his improvements in the estate records. He said that did not automatically give my uncle the right to transfer the land, but it did mean the cabin itself could create a legal dispute if somebody wanted to fight about it. That was the first time I felt genuinely nervous. I was not worried about losing the land. I was worried about the cost and stress of defending something that should have been simple. I asked the attorney what I should do. He told me to keep every document. He told me not to make casual promises. He told me to stop handling the issue through family conversations and keep everything in writing. That advice sounded extreme at the time. I followed it anyway. I created a second folder. This one had every text message related to the property. I saved screenshots. I downloaded utility records. I requested copies of the insurance policy. I organized the tax receipts by year. I pulled the deed from the county records website. I even printed the property record card. I did not confront my uncle. Instead, I waited. That turned out to be important. A few weeks later, my cousin sent pictures from the cabin. He had already started measuring the kitchen. He said he was thinking about buying cabinets. I told him that was not a good idea until the ownership issue was sorted out. He got defensive. He said his father had already given him permission. I asked whether he had anything in writing. He did not. He said I was making everything complicated. I apologized and told him I was only trying to avoid a problem. He did not answer. That night, my uncle sent me a long message. He accused me of using technicalities to control the property. He said the family had always considered the cabin his. He said I was acting greedy. I did not respond immediately. I read the message several times. Part of me wanted to defend myself. Another part of me wondered whether he actually believed what he was saying. That possibility bothered me more than if he had simply been lying. I finally replied that I was not trying to control anything. I said I was trying to understand who legally owned what. I asked him to send me any paperwork showing that the cabin had been transferred to him. He never did. Instead, he stopped responding. For about a month, things were quiet. Then I got another call from the insurance company. This time, there had been an inquiry about a contractor working on the property. I asked whether work had started. They said they could not confirm that. I drove out to the cabin that weekend. There were fresh tire tracks in the driveway. The porch had new boards. Someone had removed several old cabinets from the kitchen. I felt my stomach drop. I called my uncle. He was irritated that I had gone there. He said my cousin had been cleaning things up. I asked why. He said because the cabin was going to be his eventually. I told him again that I owned the land. He said everybody knew that was not the whole story. We ended the call without resolving anything. That was when I started considering selling the property. I had been thinking about it for months anyway. The cabin needed more work. The family arguments were getting worse. I was not interested in spending my weekends defending an asset I barely used. A local buyer had approached me about the land because he was looking for acreage to expand a small business. The buyer was not interested in the cabin. He wanted the land. I told him the situation was complicated. He said he was willing to wait. I spoke with an attorney again. He told me I could sell the property if I wanted to, but I needed to disclose the existing structure and the known dispute surrounding it. I did exactly that. The buyer reviewed everything. He understood that there might be a separate claim related to the cabin. He still wanted the land. We signed a purchase agreement. The closing was scheduled for several weeks later. I did not tell my uncle. I did not tell my cousin. I did not tell the extended family. I told my mother because she was the only person I trusted to hear about it without turning it into gossip. She was shocked. She asked whether I was sure. I told her I was. She said my uncle would lose his mind. I told her I knew. She asked what would happen to the cabin. I told her I was still working that out. The buyer was willing to purchase the land without taking possession of the cabin immediately. That required additional paperwork. The cabin could either be removed, transferred separately, or remain temporarily under a separate agreement. It was complicated but manageable. I spent several weeks going through every document. I wanted everything clean. I wanted no ambiguity. The closing attorney reviewed the title history. There were no liens against the land. There was no deed showing my uncle owned the parcel. There was no recorded transfer of the property to anyone else. The only potential complication was the historical claim to the cabin. I was comfortable enough with that risk to proceed. Then came the dinner. My uncle announced that he was giving the cabin to my cousin. I told him I had sold the land. He immediately demanded to know how I could have done that. I said I had been the legal owner. He accused me of hiding the sale. He was right about one thing. I had hidden it. I had kept it private because I did not trust him not to interfere. My cousin asked whether the sale had actually closed. I told him the closing was scheduled. That changed the mood in the room. My uncle said the sale could not possibly be valid because the cabin belonged to him. I did not argue. I told him he should have his attorney review the documents. He stood up. He accused me of betraying the family. My grandmother started crying. That is the part of the evening I still feel guilty about. Not because I was wrong to sell the land. I do not think I was. I felt guilty because the entire family had built an emotional history around that cabin, and my decision changed everything in a single night. My mother asked me whether there was any way to keep the cabin in the family. I told her I was open to discussing it. But I was not going to cancel the land sale simply because my uncle had announced his own plan without speaking to me. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls. There were messages from relatives I barely spoke to. Some accused me of stealing the cabin. Others said I had broken my grandfather's wishes. One person told me my grandfather would be ashamed of me. I ignored all of them. I called my attorney. He told me not to respond emotionally. He said the paperwork would speak for itself. That phrase became the thing I repeated to myself for the next several months. The paperwork would speak for itself. My uncle hired an attorney. That did not surprise me. What surprised me was the letter I received. It claimed my uncle had an ownership interest in the cabin and demanded that the sale be stopped. It also claimed I had acted in bad faith by selling property connected to a family asset. My attorney reviewed the letter. He said most of it was argumentative, but one part mattered. My uncle was asserting that my grandfather had verbally promised him permanent ownership of the land. That claim was difficult because verbal promises can create confusion even when they do not override recorded documents. I asked whether the sale could actually be blocked. My attorney said it might be challenged. He also said the strength of any claim would depend on evidence. That meant I needed evidence. I went back through the family records. I found old tax documents. I found letters from the estate attorney. I found an appraisal. I found a property inventory. Then I found something I had forgotten existed. It was a handwritten note from my grandfather. My mother had given it to me years earlier. I had kept it in the same folder as the deed. The note did not say anything dramatic. It simply explained that he wanted the land preserved for me because he believed I was the grandchild most likely to maintain it responsibly. He also wrote that my uncle had built the cabin with permission, but that the land should not be separated from the rest of the estate without a formal agreement. The note was not a deed. It was not magical, but it was consistent with the probate documents. I gave it to my attorney. He said it was useful context. That was when I started understanding what had really happened. My uncle had convinced himself that because he built the cabin, he had earned the land too. My grandfather had apparently seen things differently. The problem was that nobody had forced that distinction while my grandfather was alive. After he died, everyone simply kept using the same family language. The cabin was my uncle's. The land was mine. Nobody said both things in the same sentence. That ambiguity lasted for years. Then money entered the picture. My cousin wanted the cabin. My uncle wanted to give it to him, and suddenly the distinction mattered. The case did not go straight to court. There were negotiations first. My uncle wanted me to cancel the sale. I refused. He wanted me to transfer the land to him. I refused that too. My attorney suggested one possibility. We could allow my uncle to make a claim regarding the cabin itself while preserving the land sale. That meant the buyer would proceed with the transaction while the cabin dispute was resolved separately. The buyer agreed. My uncle did not. He insisted that the entire property was his. That position made the matter simpler in one strange way. He was no longer arguing about a family understanding. He was claiming outright ownership. That meant the documentary record mattered more. During discovery, his attorney requested copies of the deed, tax payments, insurance records, utility bills, repair invoices, and communications. I provided everything. I had almost 7 years of records. My uncle had almost nothing. He had receipts for the original construction materials. He had some photographs. He had a few old checks showing he had paid for renovations. That evidence supported one thing. He had invested money in the cabin. It did not show that he owned the land. There was also a problem with his story. He had told several people that my grandfather had given him the property, but when asked for proof, he could not produce a deed, written agreement, or transfer document. One of the old contractors who had worked on the cabin provided a statement saying he had always understood my grandfather to own the land and my uncle to own the building he had paid for. That distinction sounded odd when written down. In practice, it explained everything. My attorney told me the situation was still messy. There was no guarantee. He said legal disputes rarely follow the clean narrative people imagine. He warned me that even strong documents do not eliminate expenses. He was right. I spent money on legal fees. The land closing was delayed. I had to update my insurance. I had to provide additional disclosures to the buyer. I missed work for meetings. I stopped attending some family gatherings. The emotional cost was worse. My grandmother blamed herself. My mother was caught in the middle. My cousin stopped talking to me. My uncle told relatives that I had manipulated the entire estate. I started doubting myself. There were nights when I wondered whether keeping the land would have been easier. Then I would look at the repair bills. I would look at the taxes. I would remember that nobody had offered to reimburse me for any of it. I realized I was not actually fighting over a cabin. I was trying to stop my family from rewriting ownership based on whoever had spoken most confidently at the dinner table. The biggest turning point came from a bank statement. During the estate review, my attorney discovered an old escrow document connected to my grandfather's mortgage. The document included the original legal description of the land and references to the cabin. It showed my grandfather had owned both the land and the improvements at the time the cabin was built. Later records showed that my grandfather had allowed my uncle to improve the structure without transferring ownership of the underlying parcel. That filled an important gap. My uncle had never been legally granted the land. He had permission to build. He had acted as though permission had become ownership. Those are not the same thing. The mediation session took place several weeks later. I sat across from my uncle at a long conference table. It was the first time we had been in the same room for months. He looked tired. I probably did too. There was no dramatic shouting. That surprised me. Instead, both attorneys spent hours going through documents. The mediator kept separating legal questions from emotional ones. My uncle kept returning to family history. He talked about building the cabin with his own hands. He talked about weekends spent there. He talked about memories with my grandfather. I understood why he felt ownership. I really did. If I had built a cabin on family land and spent 30 years maintaining it, I might have felt the same emotional connection. But emotional ownership was not the same as legal ownership. Eventually, my uncle acknowledged that he had never actually checked the title. He had assumed it had been transferred. That admission changed the tone of the room. He had been treating his assumption as a fact for years. I had been treating the paperwork as a technicality. Both of us had made mistakes. The difference was that his mistake affected a property he did not own. The final agreement was not what anyone expected. The buyer completed the purchase of the land. My uncle retained ownership of the cabin structure for a limited period under a written agreement. He had to arrange for the cabin to be relocated or removed within a specified amount of time. That was not easy. Moving the cabin would have been expensive. He eventually chose to sell the structure to my cousin. My cousin paid for it. He had to move it onto land my uncle purchased separately. The deal took months. There were contractors. There were permits. There were inspections. There was an argument over who would pay for the electrical work. It was boring and expensive and completely unromantic. That was probably the most realistic ending we could have had. The land sale finally closed. I used the proceeds to pay off the remaining mortgage on my house and put the rest into a retirement account and a savings account. I also paid down a large chunk of my student debt. For the first time in years, I did not have property expenses hanging over me. My cousin eventually moved the cabin. He renovated it slowly. I saw pictures online through mutual relatives. It looked better than it had in years. I was surprised that seeing it did not make me angry. Mostly, I felt relieved. The cabin had become a symbol of every unresolved family disagreement. Once it was physically somewhere else, the emotional pressure seemed to decrease. My uncle and I did not speak for nearly 8 months. Then my grandmother had a health scare. The whole family gathered at the hospital. That was the first time I had seen my uncle since the legal matter ended. He looked older. I did too. We did not hug. We did not pretend everything was normal. We simply sat in the same waiting room. Eventually, he apologized, not for everything, not for accusing me of stealing, not for the messages, just for assuming he had the right to give away something he did not own. I appreciated that more than I expected. I told him I was sorry I had kept the sale secret. He said he understood why I had. That was about as much closure as we got. My cousin was harder. He still believed I had taken something that was meant to be his. For a while, I accepted that. I did not try to change his mind. Then one afternoon, he reached out because he was dealing with a problem with the cabin. A contractor had found water damage. He needed the original repair records. I still had them. I sent copies. He thanked me. After that, things slowly improved. We were never as close as we had been when we were kids, but we stopped fighting. My mother told me later that the family had quietly accepted the truth long before anybody said it out loud. She said several relatives had known the land was in my name. Nobody wanted to challenge my uncle because he was louder and more confident. That bothered me. It made me realize how much of family conflict is not caused by facts being unavailable. Sometimes everybody knows the facts. They just allow one person to speak over them for so long that eventually the fiction becomes more comfortable than the truth. Looking back, I should have addressed the ownership issue years earlier. I should have made everyone use accurate language. I should have told my cousin that the land belonged to me when he first started talking about the cabin being his. I should have kept better records from the beginning. Most of all, I should have understood that avoiding conflict does not always prevent conflict. Sometimes it just delays it until the consequences are bigger. I also learned that being technically correct does not automatically make you emotionally right. There were moments when I could have handled things differently. I could have told my uncle about the sale before signing it. I could have explained my concerns instead of keeping everything private. I could have tried harder to preserve some kind of family agreement. But every time I think about that dinner, I remember that I was not the one who started planning to transfer property without speaking to the person listed on the deed. I had been quiet for years. That quietness became part of the problem. When people kept saying the cabin belonged to my uncle, I let them. When my cousin assumed the property would be his, I did not correct him. When my uncle started talking about renovations, I tried to avoid an argument instead of confronting the ownership issue. By the time I finally acted, there was already a mountain of misunderstanding. The reason the sale held up was not because I had some secret trick. It was because I had documents. I had the deed, I had tax records, I had utility bills, I had insurance records, I had repair invoices, I had the probate documents, I had correspondence from attorneys. I had years of evidence showing that I had treated the land as my responsibility. My uncle had memories. Memories mattered. They just were not enough to transfer real estate. I still have the binder. I keep it in a fireproof box with my other important records. Sometimes I look at it and laugh at how ordinary everything looks. Receipts, tax statements, insurance renewals, contractor invoices, copies of forms, nothing dramatic, nothing that looks like it could divide a family. But those papers were what kept the situation from becoming a story where everybody simply remembered things differently and the loudest person won. The strangest part is that the line my uncle said at dinner has become a family joke now. Not because anyone thinks the situation was funny, because the sentence itself ended up exposing the exact problem. He said I had been using the family cabin long enough. What he meant was that he believed the family had emotionally given him ownership. What I heard was that he had never actually checked whether he legally owned anything. When I opened my phone and told him the land had already been sold, I was not trying to humiliate him. I was trying to stop the conversation from being based on a false assumption. The sale itself did not solve everything. It created its own set of problems. There were legal fees. There were delays. There were strained relationships. There were months where I wondered whether I had made the right decision. But eventually the facts were stronger than the family narrative. That is probably the biggest lesson I took from it. I used to think staying calm meant staying silent. Now I think staying calm means being willing to let people be angry while you stick to what can actually be proven. I learned that records are not about expecting the worst from your family. They are about protecting everyone from arguments over memory. I learned that verbal understandings are useful until somebody remembers them differently. I learned that family property should never be left in a vague middle ground just because nobody wants to have an uncomfortable conversation. And I learned that sometimes the most satisfying ending is not seeing somebody get punished. It is watching the truth become too boring and documented to argue with anymore. My grandmother still talks about the old cabin. She misses having everybody there during Thanksgiving. My cousin still owns the structure. My uncle still calls it his cabin when he talks about the years he spent building it. I do not correct him anymore. The difference is that now everybody knows what he means. He owns the memories. My cousin owns the cabin, and somebody else owns the land. As for me, I sold the property, paid my debts, fixed my finances, and moved on. I have not bought another piece of family property since. Whenever somebody tells me that something is just understood among relatives, I get very quiet. Then I ask whether it is written down. Nobody in my family laughs at that question anymore, and honestly, neither do I.